Good afternoon, Inspector. The session is live again now on YouTube.
All right, thank you. So the inquiry is resumed. Is everyone? I haven't seen Mr. White. Yes. Right. So the inquiry is resumed, and I'll continue with Mr. Howell Williams and Mr. Smith. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Mr. Howell Williams, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry, but I've just been in our timely break. I've just been rereading my landscape and visual appraisal. I wonder if I can make a clarification to an answer I gave earlier on, because I think it might help.
Yeah, of course.
So the inspector rightly noticed that the character assessment referred to St. Michael's Church, and we both then said, oh, well, it must mean St. Mildred's. I really don't think it does. And I'm just looking at 4.2.3 of my assessment, and it obviously refers to St. Michael's Church. And I then go through a process of picking features which I think are characteristic of our site, and I refer to St. Mildred's in that. Now, I can understand where the confusion might come, but St. Michael's is also a prominent spire, and it's on the settlement edge, and it's visible across this character area. So it's on the northern edge of the town, and it is visible from the surrounding countryside. So it's quite clear when you look at how that character area is disposed, that a very large section of the Woodchurch undulating farmlands will get glimpsed views towards St. Michael's. And it does, just looked at the St. Michael's website, and it talks about how prominent the spire is. It's a very clean white stone. So it's another tall tower. So my mistake, I think I've given you the wrong impression. Going back to my assessment, it's quite clear that whilst the character assessment refers to St. Michael's, I then go on to assess the prominence of St. Mildred's, but the two are different things. So in terms of your identifying key characteristics, that is referring to a different church in the character assessment.
Right, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. I wasn't aware myself. That's why I certainly put it up. But
thank you for allowing me to explain it, sir.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It looks as if, well, it may well be that we've both made the same mistake, Mr. Smith. But the important thing is that we made the same mistake, and that we agree that it's St. Mildred's, in the context of the appeal site, that is a prominent landmark.
I think that views of St. Mildred's, I think, are important, but the important thing is in terms of your SPD and the character assessment, that's not what it mentions.
So can you just agree with me, so I've got a clear note, that St. Mildred's, so far as the appeal site is concerned, is likewise a prominent landmark feature?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Can we turn to a new matter, albeit related? In terms of landscape value, it's relevant and important, isn't it, that the land is publicly accessible?
I'm sorry, can you clarify your question?
Yeah, sure. When considering and assessing the value of the landscape, one of the important factors is public accessibility and enjoyment, for example, on a public right-of-way.
Recreational value is one of the factors for assessing value, yes.
So,
if that's what you mean.
Sorry?
If that's what you mean, recreational value.
Yes, I didn't put it quite like that, but I think you have agreed. I don't want to quibble over every answer, Mr. Smith, but I put my questions quite carefully, I hope, and reference to a public right-of-way plainly does provide a recreation value, and it is important and relevant for the purposes of assessing landscape value. Recreation value is the term given to it in the guidance, isn't it?
Yes.
which is why I felt confident about putting the question that I did, which related specifically to public rights of way. This public right of way, that is AB 12, is very well used, isn't it?
Yes.
And it provides, doesn't it, significant amenity value.
I think it's it's an attractive walk and a well-used walk.
And we have in mind that in terms of it being of significant amenity value, the guidance in relation to this point, that users of the right of way, they're important because their attention or interest is likely to be focused on the landscape and on particular views.
Yes, that's what Glibia 3 says, yes.
Yeah, and that's for the inspector's note, paragraph 6.33. Could you look to your proof, please, at paragraph 276. You have that?
Yes, I have that.
And what you say there, in the context of the landscape setting of settlements, there's also a recreational dimension.
Yes.
The landscape setting should provide access to the countryside from the settlement edge, but you say there is limited formal access to the appeal site, with formal access being limited to crossing the site from north to south on AB 12.
Yes.
There's also no formal right of way that provides access from the settlement edge across the site towards the open countryside to the east. I'm assuming you mean there isn't a west-east footpath.
Correct.
But there is nonetheless AB 12, which we know is very well used, connecting communities to the north and south, providing a significant amenity value with attractive views both west and east. It's not reasonable, is it, to say, as you do in the last sentence of that paragraph, that in recreational terms, the site therefore makes only a minor contribution?
I think it is reasonable, and it's particularly reasonable when you compare it with the appeal proposals, because clearly, looking at the master plan, if we just...
Mr. Smith, can I interrupt? I'm awfully sorry. I'm not talking about impacts yet, okay? I'm talking about existing landscape assessment, okay?
I was just trying to provide clarification to my answer.
Well, I don't think you were. You were going on to make a comparison with the proposal. I'm not asking about that, okay? I'm asking you to help me, help the inspector in assessing the value of this landscape. You've agreed it's important to look at recreation. You've agreed that the footpath is very well used, and you've agreed that there are attractive views with significant amenity value. Leaving aside impact, that's the position. If, assuming that you're not going to backtrack on those answers, it doesn't then make sense to say that, as you do in the last sentence, that public access here makes only a minor contribution.
It does make sense, because the only access, formal access to this site is that path. So we have 24 hectares of appeal site, and the only formal recreational access is along that path and views to the west and east of it. And if you'll permit me, in that context, that is very different to our proposal, which is obviously to allow much more recreational access over the entire site.
Okay, well, I've put the point to you, and the inspector will form a judgment about whether that's a minor contribution, because it's a pretty important point when assessing the value of the landscape at the settlement edge, isn't it?
Without a doubt, it's a consideration, yes. But, you know, I'm sure that Mr. Withicombe would accept the formal access to this site, and he has accepted, it is limited to AB 12, 24 hectares and only one path allows formal access.
Yeah, but what you're missing is the point, Mr. Smith. He did agree that there was one footpath. That's a question of fact. But what was not put to him was how much of a contribution it made in terms of assessing the settlement edge.
And in fairness, what I mentioned in my in chief is that I said that the views from AB 12, for example, towards St Mildred's, are part of the setting of the settlement. So I agree with that.
Right. Well, we'll leave that with the inspector. I put the point to you. Where in the visual impact assessment do you deal with the question of the landscape setting to Tenterden as a landscape feature?
Well, technically, it's not really a landscape receptor. So that's why it doesn't form one of the receptors. And of course, Mr. Withycombe has agreed with the landscape receptors as assessed in the LVA. So that's not between us. But the LVA does deal with setting, for example, in the conclusions.
Right.
So for example, page 32, it talks about under, in relation to HOE AL5, it talks about how the development would protect the setting of Tenterden by conserving, this is, sorry, Roman 2, 6th paragraph down on page 32. And I talk about how the development protects the setting of Tenterden, conserving views towards St Mildred's, conserving the network of hedgerows and mature trees, enhances setting by creating a new country park. Obviously, I then go on to provide a little bit more detail about the country park. And I think the final conclusions as well, I talk about the distinctiveness of this part of the setting of Tenterden. You can see there, last sentence of the conclusion says the design has in particular sought to retain the distinctiveness of this part of the setting of Tenterden by, and the bullets there, I shan't repeat them, the inspector can read those.
Okay, so do I take it then you've covered the point you think in the conclusions, but not assessed it as a separate exercise? I think that was what Mr. Withycombe was putting to the inspector. Which
it's not been assessed as a separate landscape receptor because it's not one distinct landscape receptor. And what confuses me slightly is that Mr. Withycombe has accepted the landscape receptors that we have used for the assessment. So why we can't include it as a landscape receptor because it's not homogeneous. It isn't a unit. I can't assess the setting of Tenterden as a unit. So it is better to do the landscape assessment, assess the various components and the effects on those components, and then conclude with a judgment about effects on setting. So that's what I've done.
So is this right? You draw a conclusion from the work done following the guidance, but out with the guidance, and therefore the formal receptor approach, you've not carried out an assessment in the LVIA document.
That's not what I've said at all. I'm sorry, that's completely mischaracterized what I've just said. What I've said is that I have carried out a landscape and visual appraisal. I can't use it as a receptor because it isn't a homogeneous standalone receptor. I have then drawn from that assessment, but I've also drawn from, and you can obviously see it within the LVA, I've included an analysis of the design. So I've pulled together two threads of the assessment, and that's exactly what I do in my proof as well. I've pulled together the landscape and visual elements. I've pulled together the design elements. I pull it into a conclusion, and the conclusion is about the setting. So the setting is as much about not just the landscape and visual effects, but also the landscape design. And if you read my landscape and visual appraisal as a whole, that is clear.
And in your LVIA, in terms of the judgment about recreational value, and I'm looking to pages 62 and 63. And
obviously this has been superseded by the one in my proof.
And you'll see at the bottom left-hand box, there's says their recreational value, okay, and then community assessment. And then it says, at present, the site can only be accessed by using footpath AB12.
Yes.
Then there's a reference to the other sites. Is it fair to say that in the LVIA, in terms of assessing landscape by reference to recreational value, you don't express the point in the same, if I may say so, well, as I put to, unreasonably negative way of making a minor contribution?
You're asking me, forgive me to clarify, you're asking me if I, sorry, can you ask the question again? I'm not clear about what you're saying.
Yeah, okay. In your proof, do you see, I put to you that you've been rather unreasonable and unfair
Yes, yes,
in describing the well-used footpath with significant views, etc., as a minor contribution. Yeah?
yes, yes.
And then I've asked you about your visual impact assessment, where you say it can only be accessed by footpath AB12.
Yes.
And that's the limit of it. So you don't attach to it the same negative language as you do in your proof. And it's plain, isn't it, that you haven't regarded it in your visual impact assessment of having the same impact and adverse effect, if you like, on your landscape assessment as you do attribute to the point in your proof of evidence.
I think that is not the whole truth. And if I can refer you to page 49 of my proof, which gives the updated assessment, I hope this helps, but that has the updated assessment of recreational value. And that states, similarly, the only formal access to the appeal site is currently along footpath AB12 and also to the football pitch north of Appledore Road. Walkers will enjoy views to the west and east from AB12. So that maybe provides something that you felt was missing. It doesn't change my assessment because it still means that formal access to the site is limited to AB12, but that gives a fuller account because it includes the views as well.
Yeah, no, it doesn't really provide any comfort to me, nor really address the point that I'm making, which is this, that in the LVIA, the reference to recreational value, the input to the assessment is fairly neutrally expressed. There's one footpath, and that's taken into account. However, when it comes to your proof of evidence, the language used, the tone of it, and the meaning and the message is far more negative.
I think, in fact, what I've said is that it doesn't make a major contribution to the setting, and I stand by that. I think that it is a very small point of access to the site, albeit that it provides some attractive views. And again, I won't waste inquiry time on this, but I would say by comparison, if you have the appeal proposals and the recreational opportunities they offer, it is quite clear that the existing site offers a minor contribution in comparison with that.
Well, I suggest that there's been a creep, if I can put it that way, between the visual impact assessment and your proof of evidence here, and an inconsistency. Okay?
I'm afraid I disagree.
And there's no reason, is there, why the significant recreational value, significant amenity value of that footpath, the well-used activity on it, the attractive views west and east, cannot continue?
In the absence of the proposals or with the proposals?
In the absence of the proposals.
Of course not.
Of course not. And indeed, the informal walks and the efforts to have confirmed the order footpath AB70 are again indicative, are they not, of the high level of use of the site informally and the value given to the amenity of the site by the local community.
I'm not sure those points are connected. Look, in terms of the status of AB 70, I'll refer you to Mr. Ross, because that's a planning matter. And all I know is it's not there, it's not formal, and we have an inquiry pending.
Okay, well, I've put the question there, and you've said you don't see how what the connection is. And if and when that order is confirmed, it will further increase the recreational value, which feeds into the landscape assessment.
If it were to be confirmed,
Sure.
then it would make a difference, but that's hypothetical, isn't it?
And likewise, albeit of limited weight at the moment, the neighbourhood plan promotes the site for local green space, doesn't it?
It does. I've read Mr. Ross's proof. He attaches very limited, if any, weight to that document. Again, it's out of my remit and above my pay grade to comment on what weight should be attached to it, but it's not there. It's not. It doesn't exist. So it's hypothetical, isn't it?
So far as your advice to the inspector is that so when he comes to, even outside of the guidance, do you follow me? Outside of the guidance, your view is that he should ignore the prospect of AB 70 and local green space use. Is that right?
Well, I think he should, yes, because in actual fact, AB 70 is subject to, as I say, an inquiry. It's hotly contested. So there's a very good chance it won't come into existence. Likewise, the local green space, there are a whole plethora of issues, which I won't cover in any great detail here, but there's, for a start, it's massive. Secondly, there are lots of other local green spaces that are being proposed around Tenterden. So are we to presume all of these are going to come forward? Again, they are all hotly contested. So I think the chances of that happening, well, in my judgment, it's very slight. I would say from a humble landscape perspective, we can only deal with what's in front of us, and those things are not tangible and extant right now.
So your advice is to ignore those prospects?
Well, I'm not a planner, as I say, but from my point of view, I've commented on informal paths. That's what's built into my assessment. That's what they are. They're informal paths, but they are nothing more than that. They are not formalized.
Now, could I ask you to turn to something different now, CD 61B, which is the inspector's decision in 1989. You may have it elsewhere, Mr. Smith, but that's the core document reference.
No, I actually have that one to hand.
So do you have that document on screen?
Yes, I have, yes.
Thanks. Now, you wouldn't disagree that this is a relevant document to look at in an appeal decision relating to the same land or a significant part of it?
Yes, with lots of caveats. Obviously, it's an aged decision, and things have changed to some extent. The context has changed since that decision was made. I would also suggest that part of the context, and I don't know why the 88 decision was overturned in the High Court, I have no idea, but obviously we have an 88 decision which says there would be no harm to the character of the countryside. So it has to be viewed in that context too. So we've got two aged decisions. This is the one that stands, I appreciate, but both of them say completely different things.
And in your proof, you say, paragraph 41, the point you make is, well, it's over 30 years old and the policies have changed. That's the qualification you make on this decision letter, isn't it?
Yes, that's part of it.
Well, it's the only qualification you make.
Well, no, it's not, is it? I also talk about the fact that the density of that scheme was much greater than the density of ours.
Okay, well, let's help the inspector on that. I've seen an old, a pretty poor plan of the appeal site, but I hope you and I can agree it's a smaller site, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, and it's on the west side of the footpath.
Yes.
And broadly speaking, instead of a setback of, say, one field, like the appeal scheme, it's 2 fields and with a break in the eastern boundary of the appeal site.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, I hope that's enough, okay, for the inspector to get a feel of the relevance of the points.
I think the point I would add to it is, as my paragraph 41 says, 124 homes on an area of 4.5 hectares. It's a gross density, mark you, gross of 27.5 dph. Not forgetting that our gross density is 11.74. And obviously this decision, one of the things it says is it talks about the intensity of the development and the effects that has. So that's a marked difference between the two proposals.
Okay, I wasn't going to ask you about the density or indeed about the difference between the proposals. Plainly there are differences in the proposals. I'm interested in what the inspector found about the landscape character and appearance of the land. Okay, now that's relevant, isn't it?
With the caveats I've already given, yes.
You mean the higher density of the proposal and the change in policy?
Well, yeah, I said that right at the start. You said, "Is this appeal decision relevant?" I said it is, but we have an 88 appeal decision which gave a completely opposing view. I don't know, I said, why that was overturned. Maybe it was on character grounds, I've no idea, but it will be a technicality at some point, won't
Okay,
it?
that's the other qualification. Yeah, got that.
So,
Okay, Smith, I didn't mean to ignore that. I for a moment forgot that was a qualification. So
yeah,
I've got that. But looking at this decision letter itself, okay, which is the one that you rightly said is the one that stands, the inspector does give some important findings, does he not, about relevant issues pertinent to the issues today?
yes, I think that those are. I think they're helpful. I think they've helped us with some of our design.
Good. So it's helpful, isn't it? Presumably, then you can agree, since you've taken them into account, that the points he makes about the existing landscape are worthy of a positive response in terms of the design.
I think in terms of what he says about St Mildred's, for example, being visible over a canopy of trees on the settlement edge, that is one of the reasons why when I picked up the scheme for 250 homes, which was refused, when I looked at that, I realised that we weren't able to offer the permeability and to retain those views. So that became a key factor in retaining views from AB12, and then obviously being able to offer new views from greenways throughout the site. So that had an influence, certainly on my thinking.
Sure. Okay. We see in paragraph 2, in the 4th line, the site is bounded to the northwest and the southwest by ribbons of housing fronting respectively Woodchurch and Appledore roads, while on the 3rd side is open countryside. Do you see that?
I do.
Yeah, and that's not consistent with your view, your judgment as expressed in your proof of evidence, is it?
I think it is.
Oh, so you'd be happy with describing west of the footpath as open countryside, would you?
Well, no, you've said, sorry, you read out a whole sentence. You've said it's bounded to the northwest and southwest by ribbons of housing. Yeah, I agree with that. The third side is open countryside. So that would be the area to the east of the path.
No, the east of the site, isn't it?
So yeah, east of the site is open countryside. That's right. Yeah.
So east of the site still falls west of the footpath.
The site is bound to the northwest and southwest by ribbons of housing fronting respectively Atwood Church, Capitol Row, while on the third side is open countryside. Oh, so of course, you're referring to the smaller site, and therefore the western part of the site is open countryside. That's what you're trying to say. Is that right?
No, not the western side, no. I'm referring to the inspector. I'm only looking at what the inspector's referring to. He's referring to the appeal site, isn't he?
Yes, and that's what I'm saying to you. So it's east of his appeal site, isn't it?
Let me finish, Mr. Smith. I honestly think we'll get there quicker, okay? The appeal site is to the west of the footpath. Yes or no?
Yes, I've said yes.
It's smaller than the whole of the area to the west of the footpath, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. And we know that broadly, the east side of the appeal site, it falls roughly about 2 fields to the west of the footpath.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
And so when he talks about the third side, in other words, not that fronting Woodchurch or Appledore Road, he's talking about the western boundary of the appeal site, which is roughly 2 fields in from the footpaths, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
Yes. So when he says, while on the third side, it's bounded by open countryside, it's clear that he has formed a judgment that the 2 fields between the appeal site and the footpath form part of open countryside.
Yes, he has, yes.
And that's a different judgment, isn't it, from that which you've raised?
Well, subtly, because I've said there's a transition. Mr. Withercombe and I are actually agreed on this. We've said there's a transition from an enclosed area influenced by the settlement edge to the west to an area of more open and rural character to the east. So we're talking very subtle differences here, but we're...
So Mr. Smith, cut to the chase. If you'd be happy to say, yes, I agree with the inspector on the third side, when he stands in that part of the site, 2 fields to the west of the footpath, yes, I agree, open countryside.
No, sorry, again, you seem to have mischaracterized my answer. So what I've said in chief is that we have a transition. That's agreed.
Mr. Smith, I know the transition point. You don't need to repeat it either for me or for the inspector. I do hope my questions are quite clear. I want to know whether you agree with the inspector's judgment, okay? If you do, just say so. If you don't, say why.
Let me try and be clear. I do hope we can be friends. I have said in my assessment that the western side of the path is influenced by the settlement edge and all of those factors. Yeah. I have also said it has rural attributes. I don't think it's helpful to just paint the whole thing as open countryside. It is a more subtle transition between the two. So that's why I'm trying to provide more detail.
I'm going to move on to the next question, Mr. Smith, okay? I'll make submissions on your answer. And we see further on in that paragraph, this reference to the footpath. And then in paragraph 3, in the third line, there's reference to the main issue, the availability of land for housing, which is not the same as it is now, obviously, and that's not relevant to the point I'm putting. And then whether the proposed development would detract from the character and appearance of the area. So one of the matters he had to investigate was the current existing character and appearance of the area.
Yes.
And he does that in a number of paragraphs, starting, for example, at paragraph 11. He refers to the appellant's case there, 4 points, of which the first was the site is bounded by housing on 2 of its 3 sides. Do you see that?
I do.
And the council in paragraph 12 were disputing that, saying that there was no sense of urban enclosure. So that was the sort of battle. Yeah.
Yes.
And then further on, we see in the same paragraph on my copy at the top of the next page, 5 lines up from the bottom of the paragraph, the rising ground levels towards the north and west would, in my view, compound this impression, although I note that the dwellings proposed for the western end of the site were mostly bungalows. On its eastern boundary, the site is wholly open. That goes back to the open countryside judgment he made there, and appeared to me on my visit to form an integral part of the wider rural area which rises towards the hilltop. And then in the next paragraph, he says in the 3rd line, I saw on my visit that these views, particularly from the more northerly end of the footpath, were very attractive, the dominant impression being of the church and other buildings set in a swathe of trees rising above the fields and hedgerows in the foreground. And at the end of that paragraph, he considered that the development, which would be of a relatively intense nature, would appear as a substantial intrusion into the views of Tenterden and the conservation area. This would clearly be detrimental to the character of the area. It's been suggested that the proposed housing would merely round off this edge of Tenterden. And then he refers to the linear form. It appears to him that a significant element in its character derives from the close proximity of the countryside to the heart of the town, and the local plan rightly concerned to protect this aspect of its character, which would be damaged. Now, I don't want to talk about the proposal, okay, that's of no help to the inspector, but so far as the inspector's findings of importance related to the current or then existing landscape, he considered, and this is important, isn't it, that the land was open countryside, correct?
He did.
And I've asked you to give your views about that. I'm not going to ask you again. He considered that there was no sense of urban enclosure to disturb or even qualify that finding. Would that be right?
That's what he says, yes. Obviously, it's different to the 88 decision, but yes, that's what he says.
And he formed the view that the church, the fields, the hedgerows were valuable features of that countryside.
He said they were attractive, yeah.
He also made a point of finding that the landscape was important to the setting of Tenterden, didn't he?
Did he use the term setting? I think we can interpret what he says as being setting, yes.
And he plainly reached the view that the views from the footpath towards Tenterden were important and attractive.
Yes, he does.
Sorry,
go on, ask your question first.
Well, in terms of the landscape, you'd agree with Mr. Withycombe, wouldn't you, that nothing material has changed since that time?
Well, the wider context has changed. Tenterden is less linear than it was back in 89. We've obviously had new developments. We've seen, obviously, the DAS shows us how the linear development has become something that has filled out as suburban development has spread from the main routes. Obviously, that spread is now spreading even further. So we have the likes of Tenterden, Tilden Gill. So we're seeing a settlement, like so many other settlements, moving away from its linear form. So the wider context has changed. I think the way in which we judge development has changed as well. Sorry, I'm conscious that you want me to talk about the site and the characteristics of the site.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about the wider context or development. I want to talk about the existing landscape. I've asked you a pretty straightforward question.
I think the context...
In terms of the landscape, it hasn't changed, has it?
Yeah, forgive me. How can you divorce the landscape of the site from its setting? Isn't that all landscape? I would say so. I've only been doing this for 30 years, but I have to say,
Mr. Smith, please, honestly, we're both here to try and help the inspector. My question was really straightforward, okay? And there's no trap, okay? You've still got time to qualify and add to it, but to be honest, it would really help me and the inspector if you just try to answer directly the question. Quite clear, so far as the landscape of the appeal site is concerned, there's been no significant change since those findings of the inspector, has there?
in terms of the landscape of the site in isolation, I would agree.
Well, those are the references I've taken you to, okay? So you'd agree.
But Mr. Howell, right, this is where I now get my qualification, I believe. So I can now add the very thing that I said up front, which is that the landscape doesn't just stop at the site boundaries. The inspector makes points about the linear settlement, for example. It is no longer as linear as it was when that decision was made. That's important. It informed his judgment, and it is a different situation now. And other things have changed. But anyway, go on.
No, I don't know. That's it. I've asked the question I wanted to ask.
Okay.
And could you turn to CD 2.6, please?
So, yeah. Have that?
Yep, thank you. So do you have that? It's the inspector's report in 2010.
Yeah, I've got that, yes.
Thank you. Turn to paragraph 2.98, please.
Yes, I have that, tent 18.
And we'll see there that's reference to tent 18, land north of Appledore Road. I recognise the landform would preclude wider views of the site from the east. However, the site forms a wedge of countryside, characteristic of the urban form of Tenterden as a small market town in a strongly rural setting, which would be eroded on development. And again, you see then he turns to the roadside trees, which he was concerned about as well, and the distinctive approach to the town. But again, the same point, that his view about evidently that this piece of land is important to the setting of Tenterden because of its strong rural setting. That's consistent with the previous inspector's findings, isn't it?
I can't disagree that that's what he says. He says there's a site that forms a wedge of countryside. Obviously, my evidence is more detailed, provides another level of detail. Mr. Withercombe agrees that there is influence of the settlement edge. Therefore, it's a transition of character to the settlement edge. So that's the benefit of having landscape evidence, is that we're providing another level of detail.
The question I asked you, sorry if it wasn't clear, is that the finding judgment of the local plan inspector is consistent with the judgment of the previous inspector.
I thought I said yes.
No, you didn't.
Oh, that yes is the missing word then.
Yeah, thank you. And again, that's another authoritative judgment, isn't it, about the landscape character of the land forming the appeal site.
It is another judgment, absolutely. So we have
another authoritative judgment. Sorry, Mr. Smith, to pick you up, but otherwise there's no point in me asking you questions if you...
I can't, to be honest with you, I'm not being obtuse, but I can't say whether it's authoritative, but I would say, yes, it's a consideration. I think this is an inspector giving an opinion. So from that point of view...
I've said authoritative because I'd like you to think that you could agree that an inspector has reached a view that hasn't been the subject of legal challenge and then forms some part of the authoritative planning history relevant to this inspector's judgment.
I understand your question, and from that point of view, yes, it is authoritative, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Now, so far as strongly rural is concerned, you address this issue at paragraphs 270 to 271.
Yes, in terms of answering the reason for refusal, but obviously it's also within, yeah, it obviously draws on the evidence from earlier in my proof.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not going to take you through the whole of your proof. I'm trying to focus on the critical passages. So you say at 271 in the second line, there's no doubt that the eastern part of the appeal site has strong rural characteristics. Okay?
Yes.
But you then say about land to the west of the appeal site, where the proposed new homes would be located, is far more influenced by the settlement edge, and consequently cannot be described as strongly rural.
Yes.
And you based that judgment on obviously your knowledge of the site, but in particular you refer to plates 2 and 3.
That's part of my evidence, yes.
Yes, but in particular, I'd say, because those are the plates you referred to in the previous paragraph.
Yes.
Yeah, and they can be found in your proof of evidence at pages 40 to 41.
Yes.
And so that I'm clear, these photographs, the first on page 40, is that taken at a position very close to the boundary of the properties on Woodchurch Road?
Reasonably close, yeah, within 100 metres, certainly, yeah.
Oh yes, definitely within 100 metres. And not from a currently publicly accessible place.
It's not, but that, as I said in chief, that has no relevance to character.
Well, it has a relevance to landscape effects, doesn't it? I heard
Absolutely.
you say that. I made a note of it. And the question is it relevant to landscape effects? And the answer is yes.
What? The fact that you can, if you're trying to judge effects on the character of a site, and you're saying that because a photograph like this, which is evidencing character, isn't taken from a publicly accessible viewpoint, you're saying that affects what? Sorry. I'm sorry, it must be me, Mr. Smith. You know, I must have misunderstood your LVIA. Do you remember we were talking some while ago about the factors that go towards estimating the value of landscapes? Yeah. Yes, you're talking now about recreational value again.
Yes, no need to look so quizzical. I'm sure you know the point I'm making. It doesn't help the inspector to say that land that's not publicly accessible is not relevant to character without telling him that actually public accessibility is a factor for assessment of landscape effects.
I'm sorry, Mr. Howell-Williams, you've got this completely confused. You really have. I'm sorry, you really have. Look, the effects on character are absolutely independent of whether someone can access an area. These photographs are just images showing how visible the settlement edge is at the western part of the site. It doesn't matter whether I'm on a right of way or not. The point is that it evidences the fact that the settlement edge can be seen from the site. Now, therefore, it follows that those areas have an influence on the character of the site. What you're then confusing that with is you're then saying, well, hold on a second, you said the value of something is partly down to whether people can access it. Well, that's a completely separate consideration. This is a character assessment. I am giving evidence here on the character of the western part of the site. This is really important. And these photographs show that quite clearly the character of that part of the site is influenced by the settlement edge.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Smith, is that it? I don't mean to belittle the answer. I just mean to know whether you
Really, it's a really important point.
All right. So it's relevant to the assessment of landscape effects, you say. Is that right? To assessing the value of the landscape, but not relevant to character.
No, sorry. I'm trying to, these photographs are in because they are explaining the character of the western part of the site.
And that's irrelevant. Is that irrelevant to landscape effects?
No, it's not at all. It is relevant, but it has a bearing on, for example, value, because it reduces scenic quality, for example. It reduces remoteness, it reduces tranquility. So it factors into lots of judgments about landscape value.
All right. Okay, Mr. Smith, well, we'll leave that for the inspector, and I certainly will be making submissions on it. So when we look at, when the inspector goes to see this particular area, okay, he will bear in mind, won't he, that this is in one part of the site, plates 2 and 3, 2 parts, I should say.
Yes, but he will see similar views because obviously, for example, plate 3, it's a continuous. I mean, the settlement edge is about 1 kilometre long to the southwest and northwest of the site. So you will see similar views, particularly along the Appledore edge, but also there's a continuation of similar views for plate 2 along that edge to the north of the site.
So he will also take into account all the other views that are available to him, such as those in Mr. Withercomb's appendices taken from the footpath, for example.
What, AB 12? Yes,
as you rightly have pointed out, factually, it's the only footpath. So when I say the footpath, I'm talking about AB 12, Mr. Smith.
I'm glad you're with me on that one. Yes, he will. And I suggest that we do walk around this area to see, because these don't do it justice, frankly. It's a very long area of visible settlement edge.
Well, when he looks at AB 12, he will see that actually in large amount, you're aware, you might be aware of it, but you actually can't see the settlement edge.
This is where I think we come to the crux of where you're misunderstanding. This is where it leads, because if you're making a judgment about character, you don't have to stay on AB 12. You can go on to the western part of the site.
I just put that point to you. Point on plates 2 and 3 is that you sought to make your point about the perception of the settlement edge by taking 2 photographs less than 100 meters from houses, where the inspector will see as he walks around, what he sees is nothing like the impression given by those 2 photographs alone.
Well, obviously the inspector is a very intelligent man and he will see it for himself. And all I would say is it certainly isn't a wooded edge.
And could you turn now to page 64 of your proof, please?
Yes, I have that.
Thanks. So do you have that? This is plate 8.
Yes.
Yes, I've got that, yes.
And this is tent 1, isn't it, Mr. Smith?
Yes, we're looking across 1B, yeah.
And what we see is a large open arable field, is that correct?
Yes.
With no hedgerow mosaic or trees to match the enclosed fields on the appeal site. It's a marked distinction, isn't it?
Well, there are hedgerows, obviously, to the left and right of that view, but it's in front of us. We don't see hedgerows. You're right.
So I remember in evidence in chief, you were looking at your viewpoint B, do you recall?
7B, yes.
And you said that what one sees there is a largely rural pastoral landscape.
It is largely rural, yes.
Yeah, you did say that, and I made a note of it.
Yes.
whereas what we see here is you can see not only the church in tent 1, but a clear view of a hard settlement edge. Is that correct?
Yes, in the distance, yes.
And it's an uninterrupted view of that harsh settlement edge, isn't it?
Yes.
And nothing to compare with the long pastoral views that you get on the appeal side.
Well, I beg to differ, if I may, on that one, because whilst I would say that the settlement edge, I think development at the tent 1 edge, which is clearly not intended as the final settlement edge, is more dense than what we see on the settlement edge on Appledore Road and Woodchurch. It is nevertheless a visible edge, which also has trees on the skyline. And what I think is similar between the two is this is an open green field. And it's obviously next to an AONB and next to a conservation area. So there are similarities between the two. Sorry, can I just finish this point? So whilst there are differences, there are also similarities.
So, okay, so you say that there are similarities, all right? The conclusion you make on tent 1, paragraph 251 in your proof of evidence, is that this site, tent 1, has a largely rural character.
Yes.
And that's in the context of the points I put to you, that it has no hedgerow, field, boundary, enclosed pastoral landscape equivalent to that of the appeal side, that the harsh settlement edge is continuous along the boundaries. You can see it, quite different from the appeal side. So I just want to put to you, so it was a matter of judgment for the inspector, but your characterization of tent 1 of this site is surely inconsistent and incompatible with your resistance to use the same description for the appeal side, or resistance to say it's strongly rural.
Oh yeah, there are two different points there, aren't there? So my resistance or my clarifications on the appeal side were to do with the fact that I was saying it's a more nuanced conclusion that I've come up with. I've said it's a transition between characters, and effectively your witness agrees with that. My point on this one, I would say the susceptibility of this site here in this image, plate 8, susceptibility will be lowered by the visibility of the existing settlement edge. So you have a sense of being on the settlement edge, and to that extent, it's not strongly rural. So I'd agree with that. This isn't strongly rural because it's influenced by a visible, dense settlement edge.
Sorry, just so I'm clear, sorry to interrupt, Mr. Smith. Are you saying that the tent 1 site is not strongly?
I'm saying it's not strongly rural.
Oh.
No, it's not strongly rural. I said
it's largely rural.
It's largely rural, yeah. It's got a lot of rural characteristics. It's got hedgerows, open fields, it's next to an AONB. Strongly rural is clearly another notch up, isn't it? Strongly rural. That would, absolutely. Strongly rural would be something that has remoteness, tranquility, intact landscape elements. That's what strongly rural means. Sorry, let me finish. If you've got detractive elements, then TGN 0221, for example, is very clear that that is something that isn't just purely rural. It's something that therefore has influences of other factors. And that's the same with our site. We have something which, again, Mr. Withicombe agrees with this. There is an area to the west which is influenced by the settlement more than the more remote and rural area to the east of the ridge. On this site, this isn't strongly rural, again, because it is influenced by the settlement edge. The susceptibility for this, just as for the western part of our site, therefore will reduce to something like medium, the value, well, it's within the setting of the AONB. So, but let's say, it's going to be at least a medium value. And then what's going to happen, obviously, is when you put 225 houses on that piece of land, clearly you will get a substantial magnitude of effect.
Okay. I'm certainly not talking about magnitude of effects or any such business. I'm asking you about the characterization of two sites where in one you resist the description strongly rural, and yet looking at tent 1, you say that that site is largely rural. I am going to make the submission that they are wholly inconsistent and incompatible.
I'm sorry you feel that way. I feel they're very different things.
Yeah, well, that's rather the point I'm making, that the sites are completely different, and your version, your reason for not attributing the phrase strongly rural to the appeal site is because of the influence of the settlement edge. We've been through that, and the inspector will see it on site. But when it comes to tent 1, you say, well, that is largely rural. So you're hanging on a distinction between largely rural and strongly rural.
Well, if it makes you feel any easier, I would say that the western end of the appeal site is largely rural, but with influences from the settlement edge. Does that give you more compatibility? Because to me, there's complete consistency in my judgment on both of these sites.
I've made a note that notwithstanding our difference, that you have at least accepted that land to the west of the footpath is largely rural.
Yes, I can accept that.
272 to 277, the paragraphs where you seek to address the point about the landscape setting of the southeast side of Tenterden.
Yes.
And the question is, as encapsulated in paragraph 272, the third proposition in this reason for refusal, the appeal site performs a positive role in contributing to the setting of Tenterden. Okay?
Yes.
And you say, as a starting point, it's undeniable that the appeal site comprises agricultural land on the settlement edge. And you and I would say, well, happy to use the phrase largely rural setting.
Yes.
And to that extent, you say it forms part of the landscape setting. And then you say it affords views of the St. Mildred's Church, which you rightly say can often be viewed over the canopies of existing trees. And then you say in the next paragraph, you make the point about the influence from the houses. And again, the inspector will see that when he goes to see the site, okay?
Yes.
From all the relevant locations. So I don't want to ask you about that again. And over the page, the next point is at 276, where you make the point about the recreational dimension.
Yes.
Remember? And
yes.
I've asked you about that, so I don't want to go into detail about it. The inspector will remember that exchange. Okay, your point about it only makes a minor contribution. Remember?
Yes.
And I said that was unreasonable and unfair, and you disagreed.
You did.
And then you conclude, in summary, the site doesn't form part of the landscape setting for Tenterden. It does form part of the landscape setting, but its contribution is not entirely positive.
Yes.
So going back to the question at 272, and it sounds like an advocate's point, but it isn't. It's really just me trying to get a clear answer to the question that you yourself have posed. You said it's not entirely positive.
Yes.
But you haven't answered the question directly. Does the appeal site perform a positive role in contributing to the setting of Tenterden?
Yes.
And is the answer yes, largely positive?
No, it means partly positive.
So,
because that's what I say in terms of I say it's agricultural land on the edge of the settlement. I say that there are views towards St. Mildred's. These are positive attributes.
Well, yeah.
But I say that there are negatives. So obviously the backs of gardens, the effects of light and noise, means that it's a sort of a, the fact that you have an inactive edge at the edge of the settlement, the fact that you have no recreational access from the settlement edge, not formal at least, these things are not positive. So there are positive and there are negative factors.
Well, I was rather hoping that you'd agree that on balance it's largely positive, but you can't even agree that, Mr. Smith. Is that right?
No, there are definitely positive elements, and I have been honest within this assessment.
No, Mr. Smith. I asked you, couldn't you agree that it's largely positive? I would have thought that's quite reasonable in the circumstances when the inspector, he's going to form a view not only about the land and the contribution to the setting, but actually about your judgment. Okay. Now, is it your professional view that in terms of the contribution it makes to the setting of Tenterden, it doesn't make a largely positive contribution, this land, the appeal side?
I say it makes a positive contribution, without a doubt.
It does make a positive contribution.
It makes a positive contribution, and I have said that here. But I've said there are negative parts of how it functions as a setting.
Yeah, and then you said it's not entirely positive. So I've taken from that you could actually easily agree it's largely positive.
I don't understand how you arrive at that. Look, I'm saying that there are positive elements, but there are negative elements.
Okay, so it's partly positive, without a doubt positive, not entirely positive, but you can't agree it's largely positive.
No, I don't agree it's largely positive. Look, when you've got gardens backing on to agricultural fields, when you've got no recreational access, when you've got, those things are not an ideal settlement edge. That is not a good setting. So there are ways in which it could be more positive.
Okay, right. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Move on to another point. I don't think we're helping the inspector anymore on that. Paragraph 2.64, you say this in relation to scale. The proposed,
sorry, 2.64.
No, sorry, 264. I beg your pardon, Mr. Smith. 264. I just want some to answer some straightforward questions about methodology on the LVIA. And scale there, proposals include only 145 homes.
Yes.
And you say it's 4% of the population. It's right, isn't it, that that's not a landscape point relevant to the appeal site, is it?
It's not a landscape point, it's a proportionality point.
Well, obviously. Paragraph 156. Of your proof of evidence, you make the point that, and this is Mr. Withercombe has already addressed this, you say, well, it's important to acknowledge that all greenfield residential developments will result in at least some degree of localised landscape and visual harm. Remember that point that Mr. White asked Mr. Withercombe about?
Yes.
And I just want you to be able to help the inspector. Are you saying that that proposition affects the findings as to the assessment of the quality of the land or the landscape impacts in the LVIA?
No, it doesn't affect any of those judgments at all. It affects the context for understanding those judgments.
And it affects the view one takes about impact. Is that your point?
Yes. I mean, the simple fact is, if our policies precluded all negative effects, then obviously no development would happen anywhere. So the reality is, it is accepted that there are negative effects from development, and it's accepted that that localized harm will occur from greenfield development.
Sure. Thank you. And then the next point arises from the same paragraph. You say it's notable that the council concedes it doesn't have a 5-year housing land supply. Do you see that?
I do.
And indeed, you repeat that point. Are you saying that that issue affects the LVIA assessment?
No, I'm saying that it affects the context of understanding those judgments. So we have 2 points here. One, it's almost agreed between the parties that there will be mostly negative effects from greenfield development. I would say, by the way, every assessment I've ever done of greenfield development, there are negative landscape and visual effects. But then I would say that the fact, therefore, that the council doesn't have a 5-year housing land supply and is therefore looking potentially to greenfield sites, you put the two together, that is a context for understanding that maybe negative effects, like at Tent 1, for example, are being accepted in order to allow development to occur.
And that judgment is one to be taken in the planning balance, isn't it? Not by the landscape witness.
I agree, it's mostly a planning matter. However, I have to put it here because it's like a health warning with my assessment, because the negative effects have to be viewed in context. But yes, Mr. Ross obviously is the person to talk to about housing land supply and the sites that are required for that.
Well, put it another way, having regard to the magnitude of the landscape effects and the significant harm that your visual impact assessment concludes, it would not be capable of a planning permission, an overall planning grant, without benefits to prey and aid. That's correct, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I'm not following your question.
I'm putting it another way, that bearing in mind your LVIA concludes significant harm in terms of landscape and visual impact. Is that correct?
Well, it's not significant, it's not an EIA.
I won't use any other word. I'll just ignore that comment.
Just for the sake of clarity.
I'm not asking you in the context of EIA, Mr. Smith. I'm sure you understand that. Significant can be used in other contexts.
Major moderate is the term, yeah.
Right? So you acknowledge the significant adverse effects. It follows from that, doesn't it, that something else has to go in the balance in order to justify development of this site.
Well, that's a planning point, isn't it? That's exactly...
That's rather the point I'm putting to you, Mr. Smith.
Well,
it's
absolutely.
right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, so far as another point you make is 260, paragraph 260, you say this: I've noted that whilst it's best practice in LVIA terms to acknowledge the negative landscape and visual effects of introducing new buildings, this doesn't take into account the positive attributes of the appeal proposals. As I say in section 3, the proposed master plan would result in an attractive, safe and distinctive place to live. When you say it's best practice to acknowledge negative effects, it's a curious way of putting it. It's essential, isn't it, to conclude whether or not there are negative effects.
Yeah, I don't think I've expressed it very clearly. To clarify that point, what I mean is when we put houses on a green field, it is best practice to say, regardless what the form of those houses is, regardless of how they're built, it is seen as a negative effect. And that's the point I was trying to draw out in chief, because I was saying, well, look at this view. I've assessed it as a major, moderate, negative effect, but in actual fact, there are many positive elements to it.
Right, and then you say, well, it doesn't take into account the positive attributes of the appeal proposals, and
That's
here
right.
you're referring to design elements.
Yes, such as I had in viewpoint B, that photo montage I was talking about.
And there, those are matters that could be taken into account in the balance, and should be. But you're saying, but out with the LVIA assessment. Is that correct?
Not entirely, no. Do you remember the answer I gave you earlier on about setting? You asked me, does the LVA take account of the effects on setting? And I said, well, you can't assess the setting because it's not a homogeneous landscape receptor. I said, but what you can do is you can assess the effects on the landscape, and you can look at the design, and then you can bring them together and talk about the effects on setting. And that's what that assessment did. So it is relevant to the overall consideration of effects. Design is part of it. So it has a landscape and visual effect, but it also has a, if you like, an urban design element as well. So for example, I know that from AB12, you can see houses. From an urban design point of view, I think those houses will look fantastic. They're going to be high quality houses, which would look really good, low density, and they'd be seen in the context of green spaces. So it's understanding both. It's really important, which is why I go through the National Design Guide as well in my proof.
Yeah. Okay, but I think the point I'm putting to you, if I look to your LVIA, just those such matters are taken into account and built into the assessment.
Well, yes, in terms of the design, yes, they have landscape and visual effects. But the point is, I'm sorry, you're missing my core point here. My core point is, if you see houses in a view or in a landscape, it has to be assessed as a negative effect. But in urban design, in landscape design terms, it might still be a very positive asset. But that's the difference. You have to use both assessments and view them together.
And which is what you've done in your LVIA assessment.
That's what I've done in my proof. It's what I've concluded in my LVA.
Exactly. Correct. So it's not an additional point. What you're saying to the inspector is, what I have done in my assessment is take into account those very matters. So if I look to table E2, and I look at the notes, for example, at viewpoint 5, I'm looking at page 78.
Are we okay?
Yeah. Footpath AB12, high point of the ridge.
Yes, I have that.
Yep, and we look to the right-hand column, which gives notes and explains reference to the magnitude of change, which feeds into the process. And we see that there's reference to the Tower of St Mildred's being viewed in the context of existing tree canopies, and in fronting a house to the left and right of the view, vernacular material set back behind a broad buffer of the meadow.
Yes.
And that's repeated in the same view. So it's built into the conclusions in the LVIA in any event.
No, it's not fully, no, because what this does, and that's exactly what I keep trying to explain, what this does, and if you take that through to E3, follow that assessment through for viewpoint 5, it comes up with, for viewpoint 5, major, moderate, negative visual effect. And that stems from the fact that it is best practice to assume that houses on a green field within a view will cause a negative effect. However, my point is that there is a landscape design, urban design consideration beyond that, which is how will that look? How does it function as a settlement edge? And that's why I took in my evidence in chief, that's why we went through viewpoint B. I will happily go through viewpoint 5 with you and the photo montage, but I suspect you will not be keen to do that. But I feel the same way about that. And I do pull that out in the conclusions to my LVA. It's a very functional settlement edge for all the reasons that I have already set out. So that's my fundamental point. You will end up with these high levels of landscape and visual effect, but that doesn't tell you the whole story, because it's a really good design for the settlement edge, a very attractive settlement edge.
And so far as it affects the visual impact assessment, matters such as those that you raised, you say not fully taken into account, but are taken into account in the LVIA. I can see that from the table.
Yes, but you're missing the fundamental point.
I'm not missing my point, Mr. Smith. You
I
may
know,
have some other point to make.
I absolutely appreciate that you're sticking to your point, but it's important to recognise that there are design positives, even though the assessment is negative.
I'm just going to pause there, Mr. Smith, okay, because I just want to ask the inspector for some guidance, because I'm conscious of the time.
Yes.
We've both been enjoying ourselves. I suspect the inspector's partly getting worried about the time, and it is.
I was wondering how much longer you were going to take, but
well, my estimates have been completely wrong, and I apologise for that, but I can't tell the future. I've still got well, on the current rate of progress, I don't think I'll finish within half an hour.
yeah, I think it's a bit unfair on everyone to carry on much longer, actually. It does create a few problems tomorrow, but I think we're going to have to deal with those tomorrow somehow.
Sir, for my part, I'm happy to continue, but I appreciate others are involved here.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying, Mr. Howell Williams, that it's going to be at least another half hour, is it? So you're muted now.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think that must be right, sir. Yeah. You know, I have done my best to either take new points or points that I would think are very straightforward to take.
I think it's not right to carry on past 5 o'clock, really. I mean, we've had a fairly long session this afternoon, and there's no guarantee it won't be. It will be half an hour anyway.
So before we conclude this discussion, I want to know, because the only problem with the timetable tomorrow comes from the council side and their availability.
Yeah, I realise that. Yeah.
So I want to know, what I don't want to do is, if we adjourn tonight, and I don't want to finish Mr. Smith and then be told we can't continue with the programme because of availability, frankly. Because we've had the programme, I want to know that the council are in a position, whatever time we start tomorrow, to complete sports tomorrow and complete the public rights of way round table. Because
that's what I'm hoping to do. I think it's highly unlikely we're going to start ecology tomorrow.
I think that's absolutely certain, and I'm not so worried about ecology, because as far as I know, we haven't been told that Miss Forster's got any constraints for the second week. Yeah. But what I do have a concern about is, obviously, if we don't complete those 2 roundtables, according to what we've seen, both the council's rights of way officer and their sports officer both have serious constraints which will greatly impact the programme. So I just want the reassurance from Mr. Howell Williams that if we do spend the first hour tomorrow with Mr. Smith, that we'll be in a position to do both the sports roundtable and the rights of way roundtable as we've always been programmed, and there's no impediment to do that.
Yeah, Mr. Howell Williams, have you got any response?
Well, yes, I don't think there's any difficulty. I don't quite understand the frustration. We've tried to keep to the programme for tomorrow, and we've volunteered ways in which that can be done.
No,
and
you haven't.
The suggestion made, if I may finish, is that we do sports roundtable first, as I suggested, because
yes.
No, you see, you've got that wrong.
Just a minute. I've been corrected. If it's not a competitive thing. I just want to be clear, and I'm getting instructions as to availability from my left. There's no reason why we can't, as programmed, deal with the public rights of way roundtable first, and then deal with the sports roundtable second, as programmed for some considerable time. What we won't be able to do, and perhaps this was always at some risk, is get very far, if anywhere, on ecology. And
I think we're looking at not doing ecology at all tomorrow. But bearing in mind, so what I'll probably be looking at is to round off this this cross-examination and re-examination of Mr. Smith, there's one witness who wants to speak tomorrow, and then there's this is the Miss Lazelle, and then there's sports and well, there's public right of way and sports, but I mean, if it is only half an hour, but I'm not saying it could be longer, but it might be an hour maybe to finish off the cross-examination. So, but I'm hoping that we can at least finish sports. We might have at least 3 hours tomorrow to do sports and public right of way anyway. So I can't. I would have thought we'd have enough time then. But,
so can I just say, and as I mustn't disturb Mr. Howard Williams when he's making points, but I want the assurance, frankly, that we will finish sports tomorrow, because I'm not happy in view of the fact that Mr. Howard Williams has now been 3 hours, 5 minutes. He's saying it's going to be another hour, which obviously impacts the programme. I just want to make sure that the sports officer goes off, as we understand it, for the whole of next week. And I don't want to, as a consequence of delaying proceedings, that we don't get back to the sports roundtable to the third week. So I would really like all our agreement that we are going to finish the right of way roundtable tomorrow and the sport roundtable tomorrow.
Well, yeah, that's my intention. I don't know what the Mr. Howard Williams has to say on that. But
I've got nothing to say, sir. I've told you Mr. Mayert's availability all day tomorrow, and I don't see why I should repeat it.
Right. So I think we'll look.
Can I just say, sorry, sir. Sorry, I apologise, because the last email we had, now Mr. Howard Williams is saying he's going to be potentially an hour tomorrow. The last email we had, remember when we first discussed this morning, apparently the council public rights of way officer was not available after 1 o'clock. So if we don't start the roundtable public right of way till, say, 11:15 or 11 o'clock, we've then got a significant time constraint according to the council's availability, which is the public rights of way officer must finish by 1 o'clock. Now, if that be the case, I just want that I'm only acting on the information that the council provided. I've obviously got no knowledge of anything beyond what I'm told by the council. And that is what I'm identifying, that we have a deadline that the public rights of way roundtable has to finish by 1 o'clock because the officer is no longer available. If that isn't the case, I will shut up. But all I'm relying on is what we've seen in emails, that the council's public rights of way officer is no longer available after 1 p.m, which is material if we don't start it till 11 o'clock.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to make sure that we can do public rights of way. But I'm assuming that the public rights of way officer is available next week as well. But
no, she's not. Not for certain days next week.
No. All right. So we do need to do the public rights of way then tomorrow. But I certainly need assurances on that. But anyway, I think we've done enough for today. But certainly, can you make sure that we're going to have enough time to be able to cover those matters tomorrow, the public rights of way? I would have thought we should be I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, I'd be really surprised if the public rights of way is going to take more than an hour, but I'd be surprised. But anyway,
so I can help on the availability of tomorrow. As far as I'm aware, that I don't know where the 1 o'clock comes from. It may be because it fitted in with the programme, which is done from 11:30 to 1 o'clock. But the difficulty with Miss Beswick was in the afternoon, so she can stay beyond 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
She must be.
Right.
That's not what the email says, Mr. Howard Williams. If you read the email, it says she's available till 1 o'clock, but can't do any later that afternoon, which I'm drawing the inference means that 1 o'clock is her deadline. Because that's what Carissa Humphreys has told us. Can't do any later. Or have I misunderstood? Am I falling into, am I misunderstanding that
I
information?
think,
I don't think you're misunderstanding the email, Mr. White, but I've suggested why it was put in that way because it referred to the hours of the programme. I've now provided clarification that she could be available into the normal lunch hour beyond 1 o'clock, but 2 o'clock is when she really must be away.
right. I think we, I mean, unless things go completely awry tomorrow, which we can't always say they're not, I think we should be okay for that. So I don't think we're going to gain anything further now discussing it. So what I'll do is I'll adjourn until 9:30 tomorrow.
So can I just say, before you adjourn, I'm going to identify that there are two additional things that we're going to put one thing in for the sports roundtable, which is the public minutes of, let me just get it so I can, we'll send it to the programme officer, but we think it's important for the roundtable, and that is the public minutes of the Tenterden Sport, Leisure and Community Facilities Review and the minutes of the 19th of January 2022. And I will make sure that Miss Ashton emails the programme officer and Miss Tower Williams and Miss Graham Paul in the next 5 minutes with that document.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Anything else anyone wants to say before I adjourn? Right. So the inquiry is adjourned